Welcome to Lifting the Lid on Technology, a podcast series brought to you by SoftSource in association with New Zealand's leading IT vendors and experts. I'm Barry White, VCIO Principal Consultant at SoftSource. In this series, we explore opportunities and challenges in the world of IT.
My guest today is Mr. Philip Meyer, founder and director of Catalyst 345, but probably most famously known for his time in Microsoft Australia as the partner technology and strategist lead for hosting and cloud. Welcome, Phil. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Barry. It's great to be here.
Phil, I guess for the benefit of our audience, Phil is very well known amongst the partner community, both here in New Zealand and Australia, as he hosts the cloud community, probably, from what I understand, probably the largest attended monthly event Microsoft hosts in this part of the world, isn't it?
Well, I'd like to think it was. At certain times it's cracked 250, even I think there was one time it hit 500 when there was a particular announcement. We hover around about 100 every time. But I think the real thing that touches me, it's been running for 17 years. I don't think anybody's run a consistent set of webinars for an entire 17 years, 170 something episodes now. So that's really what gets me, is that people just keep coming back.
Yeah. Oh, that's an incredible achievement. I think anybody does this sort of thing knows when you get up to those sort of numbers, that's a lot of work goes into it, right?
And it's not a weekly thing, it's a monthly thing. So there's a lot of information packed into that monthly episode that I share.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good segue into probably my first question. I mean, you've been through a pretty major transition. I mean, the best part of 35 years at Microsoft, and now you're out on your own. And in reality, you probably could have walked into any of the major partners in Australia, almost had your pick of those, but you've chosen to go out on your own. Big decision.
It was a big decision, and it wasn't made lightly, and it wasn't done in isolation. I really appreciate the support. If I'd call out one person in particular, it's my wife, who's sorting out plumbing problems at home at the moment next door. She was great, giving me the support. My daughters, both very successful women, so very proud of them, giving me guidance. It really came down to a simple question: Dad, what do you like doing?
Mm-hmm.
And I like talking to partners. I like digesting the masses of information that comes from one particular vendor, Microsoft, and distilling that down and making it relevant either to the technical teams or the business teams. Now, if I thought about going to a partner, I may not have had that opportunity.
Well, the thing I'm most excited about, Philip, you and I have talked about this before, is now that you're out of the Microsoft fold and now out on your own, can talk what you so eloquently talk about, and customers can hear you speak. And I think that's just, I think that in itself is a great opportunity. And I guess one of the things, I'd like to talk about today, you're obviously at Microsoft when the new data center was launched here in New Zealand. Of course, now we've got AWS as well. And, here, you've spent a bit of time in the New Zealand market, and one of the things that strikes me, particularly now that the cloud market is maturing as it is, and there's this mentality of cloud first. But here in New Zealand, a lot of our customers still have a significant amount of workloads running on premise, really because they have to, right? They've got all sorts of technology that requires those local workloads, and so they're now really in a hybrid environment where they've adopted cloud for things like email and documents and so forth, but they're still running a lot of business workloads locally, and that's probably not going to change in a hurry, right?
Right. I totally agree. I recall going back to those hosting days I referred to, the mid-2000s. VMware was a big thing back then. There was a little bit of Hyper-V even kicking around at those times. And visiting New Zealand, very much the idea that, down the spine of New Zealand, if you think of it that way, there were definitely data centers that were popping up in Dunedin and Christchurch and up through the big towns on the North Island as well. And you can understand why, because they needed that local compute. They needed that lower latency that was necessary for transactional workloads. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the move to cloud with respect to email services, but that's store and forward. So latency isn't such an issue there. Still, sovereignty is. So we do appreciate that in certainly the government circles, there's that desire for sovereignty and having their emails locally. And so if I reflect on one of the big announcements Microsoft made going back nearly 7 years ago was what they call Australia Central. You can see it in the Azure Central. You can see it there in the list if you use the Azure portal. And that's actually a premise that's owned by Australia and New Zealand governments to address that sovereignty issue, so that the New Zealand government felt safe. The issue was they started to put some transactional workloads in there. Why is that an issue? Well, because of latency. It takes a little bit of time to get stuff across the Tasman between our 3 islands. So that was clearly something that showed up as a need. But at the same time, people had invested in New Zealand in modern equipment to support transactional workloads. So that balance was interesting. If you've invested millions, tens of millions in New Zealand, why do I want to move to where Microsoft spent tens of millions, even hundreds of millions? That is something that isn't going to happen quick. It's got to be considered. It's got to be for good reason. And there is a good reason for having, therefore, in New Zealand, a continuation of a hybrid mentality for some years to come and possibly forever.
Yeah. Certainly, I think, and I think as world affairs tend to seem to be becoming more fragile as we move forward. We've seen this with a lot of our customers, and it goes with our own hosting environments as well. People like keeping their data close to their chest, right? And I think that's particularly true of digital assets in particular. And, I know when the Microsoft data center was launched over here, that was a big part of the discussion, again, particularly with government. A lot of Māori interest was around digital assets and how do we protect those assets for the future, might, as I said, of potentially disruption that may happen in other parts of the world.
And thinking about protection, you've mentioned that protection in digital assets. As we know, 97% of attacks are not nation-state actors. That's only about 3%. There's a lot of cybercrime organizations out there attacking. So if anybody's here and they are running a data center, please ensure that you've got absolutely great digital defenses as well. You've got good software technologies, firewalling technologies to prevent those attacks of critical data that of Māori interest or national interest or even commercial interest, intellectual property.
Yeah. So on that issue of cloud, and do you think organizations are really taking advantage of cloud as a scaling platform as well as they could do? And what I mean by that is often when people look at on-premise versus cloud, obviously cost is a factor. They look at it and say, well, how much is that going to cost me a month? But they just assume they're going to run everything 24/7, right? And as they've always done. Do you think we could be doing a lot better? I guess really, I remember the early days of Azure, and I was at Microsoft at the time. That was the big sell, if you like. It was to say, well, you don't have to run these things 24/7, right?
It's interesting you say that. You're right, because it was about scalability and bursting. And we'd go and talk to electoral commissions because those are the ones who'd have an election coming up and they'd otherwise have to invest in a whole lot of compute resource to deal with the election and then wonder what to do with it when there was an election. So that was a classic case. You probably talked to the New Zealand Electoral Commission. I know the Australian Electoral Commission was spoken to about that. Various different supermarket chains, when they were having sales, Christmas time came, they'd need to burst up computing to deal with the number of transaction loads that would occur in and around Easter, in and around Christmas. That seasonality burst was something that was seen as attractive. Somewhere since then and now, the message around scalability as being a great value prop around cloud has been diluted, and it's like, it's just cloud. We certainly hear from the big vendors, well, cloud's the only way to go. At least Microsoft has both. What was Azure Stack and Azure Egg is now called Azure Local. So if you want some local compute, you can do it. But even that has lost what it was when it was Azure Stack, sadly. And there were a number of Azure Stack, Azure hubs deployed across New Zealand, where they were kind of like little Azures sitting across Dunedin and Invercargill and Christchurch, etc. Now in the Azure Local world, Azure Local has become much more of an edge computing. I guess what I'm getting at is, yes, you're right, Barry, that scalability, resilience were those first messages that came, but now it's become you're all in the cloud for everything, no matter what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm sort of continue that idea. I mean, how much is compliance now really shaping some of these decisions as well when people were looking at these options?
Well, if anything, compliance, if we think of government compliance and the regulations defined either by the New Zealand government with respect to sovereignty rules and compliance and protection of data, particularly the New Zealand government has been quite active in having new disciplines around AI policy. In Australia, the same things happen where there's regulations. So that has direct implications on these cloud vendors, the Microsofts and the AWS and the Googles as well. And byline, my daughter actually works for Google on government advice. I can see the stress in her when there's another change of policy and they've had to respond, or they've done something and then they're under inquiry. Same thing happens to Microsoft, same thing happens to AWS. I'm on two fences here, two sides. I absolutely get the need for those regulations. And I can also see that that fence is moving to the left and to the right, to moving to government and moving to innovation. So how do we balance regulation and innovation is an interesting act.
One of the things I've observed, Phil, my role as a VCIO, is that compliance is not the same for two different organisations, right? And I spend a lot of time trying to help companies understand, or at least get agreement on where their compliance actually sits, if that makes any sense. Because it doesn't mean the same thing, right? Depending on the industry you're in, depending on the assets you're trying to protect, depending on the data that you're working with, right? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for a lot of organisations. They don't even know what their liabilities really are, right?
I would imagine that New Zealand, and I don't know for sure, has the same sort of regulation requirements on directors, which is where there's multi-million-dollar penalties for loss of intellectual property and for PII. So if we just take simple personally identifiable information such as birth dates and blood types and things like that, that information can't be lost. Now, but you're spot on, not everybody works with blood types and dates of birth. Some people are working with chemical formulas and business processes, ways in which to do things that are unique and special that set them apart from anybody else. You don't want to lose that. Whilst there's the classic PII loss, which has got an identifiable cost to a director for that loss, the amount of money lost in intellectual property, the valuation of that now is the third biggest economy in the planet. Just ponder that for a moment. The loss of information of businesses, the damage done to them, equates to the third largest economy in the planet. That's what cyber criminals are now taking from New Zealand businesses, from New Zealand governments, small, medium, or large, from Australian businesses, from the global economy by stealing that information. So please, work with a partner to do an assessment to ensure that your data of all types is protected and defended against externals, but even within the business. We've certainly found with the advent of AI and the use of AI within business, it's very overlooked. It's a common term we're starting to hear now is oversharing, and we're also hearing the term shadow AI. It used to be shadow IT. Remember that one? When we had shadow IT, people would bring in the latest, coolest tool. They'd stick it on their desktop and go, hey, look at what I can do with this. Now it's a cloud service that's become shadow AI, shadow IT. Now, and it's moved into shadow AI. Look what I can do with Claude. Isn't this amazing what I can do with Gemini? Look what I can do with ChatGPT. Because there's 1,000 different AI tools that can now be installed by users without some sort of governance, compliance, put up the guardrails, stop the oversharing, protect the information within and without of the business. AI has been such an enabler, such an enabling tool for productivity and efficiency, but it's also a necessary consequence of that is the need to reconsider your compliance and governance of your data.
Yeah. And I think that's been one of the positive things that's come out of this period is I'm finding a lot more organisations, because of AI, are probably for the first time in years seriously started to question some of these sorts of things and saying, hang on a minute, that really opens the door, makes it easier for people who don't really have any data skills to go, well, actually, I'm kind of interested to find that out. See what the AI can do, and away they go, right?
Spot on. I've had case studies, and they're not recent.
I've seen a first-hand example of that as well, and it was quite innocent. In this particular case, the guardrails were pretty strong, but the particular person who had been writing up the contract had the draft in a publicly available or open SharePoint site. They eventually did put the document into the HR area, so it was secure at that point, but the draft was still sitting in SharePoint and you could find it, right? So
Right.
common problem.
Hmm.
Philip, look, I'm really conscious of the time, and as I suspected coming into this podcast, it'll be great if we could have you back next week and maybe we could start talking more about AI and Copilot and some of the new things that are happening there, and be great to have you back if you've got some time.
I have the time. Very happy to, Barry. Be my pleasure. Thank you.
That's awesome. Well, we'll catch you soon.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Lifting the Lid on Technology. To learn more about how SoftSource can support you on any of the topics covered today, visit svbgroup.co.nz/insights or find us on LinkedIn. I'm Barry White, and thank you for listening. Join us next time.